Next that we have David Tyfield, who is a professor at Lancaster Environment Centre and another of CeMoRe's long-serving associate directors and current editor of Mobilities Journal. So David has a particular interest in the emergence of globalised knowledge economy, climate change, and the rise of China, issues brought together in his recent book Liberalism 2.0 and the Rise of China, Global Crisis, Innovation and Urban Mobility 2018. David has also worked alongside John Urry on an ESRC-funded Low Carbon Innovation in China project 2013 to 17, and has recently co-edited a special issue of Mobilities on pandemic immobilities, so something that we kind of all have lived through and know very much about. So without further ado, I would like to welcome David to the stage. Brilliant.
On the main console.
It's on here.
Yeah.
This one. Okay. Get it. Okay, can I move that a bit? Yeah. Sorry, Jen, I just moved you a bit. It was blocking some of the text. Right, hello everyone. Nice to see friendly faces, new faces, old faces, guest faces, wonderful. Yeah, so I'm David Tyfield. I'm, again, another of the Associate Directors of Mobilities, and I'm going to take yet another take on the invited talk of 20 years of Mobilities, which is obviously you've been looking back 20 years, so looking forward 20 years. And thinking about looking forward 20 years, really, James was talking about the shocking fact of 20 years and how much we've aged in that period. Well, in 2 years' time, we will be in the middle half of the 21st century. So I still think of this as the early 21st century, but we're entering the middle of it, surprisingly. So let's turn back the clock first. Much of this, I guess, has already been said, but I think it's just worth a reminder. So at the turn of the century, when the Mobilities turn is first taken, the world is very different, and the focuses of Mobilities are also very different. So coming out of sociology, there is a whole raft of work around globalization against the idea of the container state and the language of methodological nationalism. There's a strong thread through the founding of the Mobilities turn, especially in John's work in trying to bring complexity into social theory. So there is, yes, we've already heard Sociology Beyond Societies, but also his book, Global Complexity. There is the whole identification of mobile lives, and in Castell's language, the space of flows. And then a recognition about the importance of consumption, not just production, a long-standing interest of John's, but then taking seriously issues of tourism, the consumption of places, the consumption of cities. And of course, all of these are immediately traceable to titles of books by John. So I think of when I came to Lancaster, I initially came as a postdoc on a project around collaboration between British and Chinese scientists around climate change. But of course, I was working with John, so I was drawn into the Mobilities sphere quite quickly. And in my first position here as a lecturer, these were the three themes of Mobilities as they struck me. There is mobility as the exploration of mobility systems, the movement of peoples, things, images, and ideas. But there's also mobility as a contemporary condition. And then finally, there's the idea of mobility at its most abstract, which is trying to reframe social theory and social thought around mobilities and complex systems. So, as Sharon said, I'm one of the editors these days of Mobilities Journal, hence the word mobilities goes into italics on this title. What am I seeing these days in terms of the articles that come in and are published? What are the various developments that we see? Where has mobilities itself evolved? Well, of course, it's evolved with issues and technologies. So there's a lot of focus at the moment, a lot of papers coming in about climate and disasters, about COVID, a lot of focus on high-tech mobilities of various kinds. So AV, automated vehicles, electric vehicles, micro-mobility, sharing mobilities, etc. We see a lot of shift also conceptually and theoretically, going to the foundations of a lot of social theory. So there's been, I think, a great deal of interest. We've just had an excellent special issue published that's looking at the relationship between mobilities and place, for instance, fundamental geographical concepts. Also about distance as well, another interesting one. We see a lot of movement towards phenomenology and post-phenomenology. A lot of exploration, ambitious theorizing around politics in terms of different kinds of politics, a kenopolitics or a chronopolitics. Great deal of focus across many papers on the everyday and the mundane, and then also in terms of the picking up of various forms of art methods. We also see the papers, I think, being increasingly politically radicalized, that there's a strong turn to issues of justice and mobility justice, and in particular in terms of theories of justice as recognition, not just as distribution or due process. So we see this in terms of the various things that you would expect around this agenda, questions of feminism, race and decolonization, strong focus for mobilities, in particular around disability, of course, also on the non-human as well. Very strong, a strong connection, which I think is relatively new, between mobilities and migration studies as well, often with very strong calls for open migration. We also see an increasingly uncompromising critique of the caste system, just calling it murderous, basically, just being completely unapologetic about that. And then focus on various types of hyper inequalities associated with mobility capital. And then last and by no means least, we also see that the purview is expanded. It's expanded geographically. So wonderful to see a lot of articles coming in from sub-Saharan Africa, from East and South and Southeast Asia, from Latin America, also on non-terrestrial geographies as well, ocean geographies, space geographies as well. And then thematically, not just peoples and ideas and things moving, but also blood moving, food moving, viruses moving. So, where next? And this is just some personal suggestions. The first thing, and I should apologize that some of what I'm going to say will be from I have said before to some of you, but not to all of you, so that's a good thing. The first thing is that, echoing much of what Nick was just saying, the climate emergency, I think, is this shift in base of mobilities in particular, and it goes beyond the language of climate transition. So transition studies has established itself quite rightly as an orthodoxy, but climate emergency presents a new and more urgent agenda. And with mobility is a key and I think often neglected aspect of this. These 3 bullet points lining up with that initial set that I said earlier. So we see that in many ways, transport and mobility systems are so-called the hardest case of mobility. We can imagine going from fossil fuels to renewable energy. We can just about imagine going from our current intensive forms of agriculture to a different kind of food system. But how do we organize mobility as a whole? and I'll say a bit more about that in a second. Then there's the idea of not just mobility as a contemporary condition, but immobility also as a contemporary condition. And where this isn't just about the movement or the mitigation of the emissions from movement, but also about the essential role of mobility and immobility in questions of adaptation, of resilience, of disaster response, and where these are all intensely political issues, potentially. And then last and by no means least, still the idea that there is still a great deal of life in the need to bring complexity into our social theorizing, but also now increasingly expanding into qualitative dimensions. So I would say cultural geography has been in mobilities from the outset, but I would say it also is increasingly present. The humanities obviously coming in there, anthropology as well. So I would say this opens up a much broader agenda, and it's not therefore just about the climate and ecological emergency, in fact, but about a language which is beginning to emerge almost into the common consciousness of the language of a polycrisis or a meta-crisis. And in terms of where we are in the early 2020s, as opposed to 20 years ago, or indeed 3 or 4 years ago, this is a statement I'm just going to make and we can come back to it. There is a sense in which I think we are now in a world war of some kind. It's just that it cannot be declared because of mutually assured destruction. So what happens in this case? What happens in the reality of a resurgent and fractal neo-fascism, which is definitely a thing now that we need to contend with, that it is an actual prospect that the next president of the United States might actually destroy that country. This is a terrifying prospect. That this system breakdown also is not just nation state against nation state. It's within nation states. This is what I mean by fractal. It's it's across the scales. It's not just geopolitical, it's also domestic. And what does AI and potentially even AGI do in all of this? This is a crisis that certainly includes the Anthropocene, but also goes way beyond that at the same time. It also goes to an agenda that is about going beyond and after Western modernity, at least so far as this is a post-peak West. It's not about saying that the West is about to implode at any moment, but I've just said that that's a possibility. But there are certainly fragmenting and contending worldviews out there, and there is no clear alternative as a global unifier on the horizon. So I think that scholarship, including mobilities, is just beginning to grapple with the implications of this. And of course, not just scholarship, thought in general, public thought, and with multiple possible responses, where we see the remaking and unmaking of established paradigms and settlements, suggesting that much of this, there is positivity, there is opportunity in there, but it isn't necessarily and clearly and only a positive development. There is a great deal of mess and fractiousness and unsettling and perplexing. And if people are perplexed, they are often scared as well. So that also, I think, needs to be borne in mind. And I should say that it's not other people are scared, it's you and me. We should also be scared in our perplexity. So there is fraught with danger here. There is polarization, enmity, and destruction as a potential here. And remembering in all of this, a theme that has come up over the last 20 years and been pulled very strongly into mobilities, which is the work of Foucault about power knowledge and the fact that this is productive but dangerous. It isn't just good or bad. So there are 3 major challenges or openings that I want to suggest. The first one is going beyond Western modernity is in fact not just going from one to another thing. It's not, in the language of Deleuze and Guattari, keeping the place, right, and then simply changing who's sitting in it. There is transformation there in terms of opening up to a wide diversity of different perspectives, many of which will be profoundly challenging to our common sense ways of thinking and indeed of teaching. And one aspect of this is that the vast majority of the world remains unattached to a literal secular materialism. So this is something that is going to be needed to be grappled with as we move beyond Western modernity. And we have stepping stones for that in terms of post-phenomenology or say non-representational thought, but there is still then a lot of work to be done here, but also a lot of potential in terms of realizing the original idea of mobilities as both complex systems and the first person within the same paradigm. The second issue is not just doing, as we have already been doing for some 20 years, pluralist and political analysis, dynamic, which means mobile, complex socio-technical natural systems, but what I'm trying to explore in terms of a civilizational turn, that we are at a civilizational moment and we need to explore that difficult, loaded word in a way that allows for there to be some future for human civilization. So, in other words, all of the above that we've had, but also foregrounding issues that tend to not make it into our discussion. Issues of ethics, of aesthetics, of living tradition, of social continuity and belonging, of just hierarchy even, of super-individual dynamics in big history. In other words, of many forms of relating to these issues, which there is too much at stake simply to hand over to right-wing populism. And where mobilities and immobilities are have a crucial role to play in this shift in view. So, for instance, empirically, mobilities has so much to tell us, so much we can look at in terms of thinking about the central role that traffic between places has played in the formation of civilizations. That civilizations do not have to be thought of in the way that nation states have been thought of in terms of methodological nationalism. Indeed, civilization invites the methodological cosmopolitanism that starts from the very beginning of the mobilities turn, but also theoretically and normatively, that in this wonderful phrase, which is a Buddhist phrase of the caravan of beings, that humanity or society or civilization is the caravan of beings trying to find a way through. In other words, it invites us to think about this as a journey that we are still exploring, rather than civilization as the end point, the thing that we turn to and pat ourselves on the back for being so brilliant about. And then the third issue, which resonates very strongly with some of those, with that little clip we had from Monica about liberty, is about liberty. It's about autonomy and the importance of this as an agenda for mobilities. So just transition is obviously a key aspect of thinking about climate emergency, and this overlaps strongly with mobility justice. And together coming together in the dangers, the omnipresent and high dangers of unjust transition, or transition doing worse, exacerbating inequalities. And this, I think, often is understood as being set up as against a given conception of liberty, that is the liberty of the liberty of the car ad, as it were, right? The open road, the free individual, of the sovereign material individual, as I say here. But mobility and liberty actually are very, very closely related, and they matter. If we think only about what I've said already about the potential rise of a neo-fascism, that however we relate to COVID, the fact that it was so easy for states to make us stay at home, the possibility of emergency powers, This really matters potentially in the future. And with COVID as simply a dress rehearsal for some excruciating questions that might arise in the context of climate disasters. What is essential mobility? Who decides, right? On what basis? For some people, seeing my elderly mother in a home before she dies, that would be essential mobility, right? Who says that it is not? And even such easy things, easy wins as leisure, tourism, and flight. If there is to be no more tourism to the Maldives, what will that do to the economy of the Maldives? So there is a terrible challenge here for us to rethink this. It isn't simple at all, but we also need to see that liberty is actually needed for expedited and just transition. It's central to the process of mass experimentation. If we're simply going to be told what to do and how to beat climate change, we won't beat climate change. In other words, there is no just transition without new liberties and without new conceptions of liberty, not just without new conceptions of justice and injustice. And this has led me to the, I don't know if it's a nice or an ugly neologism, the idea of Mobilities, putting these two things together in some way. So this is the idea of perhaps some of the cluster of articles that I hope still to be editing in Mobilities in 2030, bringing together papers that are looking beyond literal secular materialism, that are exploring socio-technical systems and new forms of civilization, and looking beyond the sovereign individual to different post-secular forms of liberty and liberality, not just liberalism. And I'll stop there. Thank you.